time for DMA Today, the non-stop segment.
Today.
So last Tuesday, Apple made some more tweaks to their DMA proposal/rules. I'm going to break these down for you. Later this spring, Apple will add a new web distribution feature that lets developers distribute their iOS apps directly from their website. This is sideloading. It's what we think of as sideloading. However, with some caveats. So this will mean that an iPhone user, they could go to a developer's website, they could download the app. They don't need to use an app store or an alternative app marketplace. Developers who want to offer this have to have a legal entity within the EU. They need to opt in to the new App Store business terms, which means they will pay the core technology fee for each first annual install over 1 million units in the past 12 months. These apps still need to be notarized by Apple, and the apps can only be installed from a website domain that the developer has registered in App Store Connect. The developer must also be a member of good standing in the Apple Developer Program for 2 continuous years or more, and already have an app that has had 1 million first annual installs on iOS in the EU within the prior calendar year. So this is kind of one of those things where the more Venn diagrams we put on this, there is a tiny amount of developers who can actually offer web distribution.
Yeah, it is. I think the thing that bothers me about this is that Apple has decided to create, in the name of security, right, a platform security, a very high bar for people to distribute their apps this way. And I am a little skeptical. I guess the question, we'll get into this in a little bit, but I guess the question is, who is the European Commission really defending here and protecting here? Because I look at this and say, if the goal is to provide access for developers to go outside of Apple's App Store, making them live inside Apple's App Store for years and be successful distributing apps inside Apple's App Store at a very high level in Europe, that's a very high bar that seems unfair to me. I get what Apple's saying here in terms of not wanting somebody to quickly create an account, launch a scammy thing, take the money and run, take the data and run. I get that, that Apple needs to apply a level of scrutiny to anybody who's distributing apps this way for platform security, but I'm not sure. I'll put it this way. I am sure there are a bunch of very good developers who have interest in doing something like this in Europe, who have been developing Apple apps for a long time, who haven't reached 1 million annual installs in the EU, right? And so to me, this bar seems too high and against the spirit of the DMA, but it may be, because I've heard a lot of people make this argument, it may be that the European Commission doesn't care so much about indie developers wanting to have freedom, and it's more about, big companies that are complaining that Apple is elbowing them out of more of their freedom and revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I agree with that, provided that this passes. I mean, this is already an amendment to the original proposal.
Right.
Like, I've seen people suggest that maybe the EU is telling Apple what they want and they're doing this. Or it could just be the case of it's been the way it's been, where the EU's like, no, that's not good enough. You need to enable this. Yeah. This is Apple's attempt at that. And who knows, by the end of this week, this could change again. But
yeah, we may have another Apple newsroom post on Tuesday that says, thanks to feedback from our developers, we've changed what being a member of in good standing is to be this other thing. Because this is a proxy. Look, these numbers are a proxy for the concept of a trusted developer who's not going to be destroying their entire track record in order to scam people. And I totally get that. This seems extreme. And if Apple's previous behavior is a guide, Apple was told to do sideloading, and they're like, all right, can we, protect, security? And they're like, well, of course, that's part of the deal is you can still do platform security. And they're like, great. And they said, well, this is how we define it. And it's entirely possible that then the regulators will come back to Apple and say, that's too high a barrier. You need to change it, which we've seen in other areas. So watch this space. But that's just what struck me here is it seems unlikely. I mean, is the goal here? I think this is sometimes a guide for seeing Apple's compliance with these things. Is the goal here to make something fair, or is the goal to make something that fulfills what the EC has asked them, but nobody will use it because it's This bar seems to be set at a level where nobody's going to use it, or almost nobody, and that's not what the point of it is. So it seems to me, but again, I'm not saying that Apple doesn't have the right. I think it's very clear, and the European Commission agrees. One of the things Apple still has the right to do is keep its platform secure, or as secure as possible, given, if you listen to Apple, given the horrible things they have to do now in Europe. But either way, this is, I can read this as an attempt to keep the platform secure. It just seems too much.
Yeah, like on that, Zach in the live chat just shared with us a link from a friend of the show, Steve Troughton-Smith, who I don't fully understand what's going on here, but it says Apple, basically there was a workshop, a DMA workshop that took place today, where the European Commission made it clear that Apple also needs to comply with the spirit of the law, which it feels like the European Commission feels like they're not. And that is an iterative process, and Apple is expected to update its compliance plan as the details are hashed out in the coming weeks and months.
Glad we did that DMA today, Art.
Yeah. Hey, this is one of those jokes that's just play dividend, because this is the thing to talk about. So.
As a side note here, because we have more to talk about in this segment, I just want to say, I had this strange sort of like sad feeling last week.
Okay.
And I realized that one of the reasons is that I don't love this topic. I think it's super important. I also don't like getting mad at Apple for its behavior, which I absolutely was last week, because I think that they behaved egregiously. I don't love that. I don't love feeling that anger. I don't love channeling it, but at the same time, I felt like it was absolutely necessary, and we have to cover this. But it is not. I mean, I actually said to you this weekend, I don't really want to cover this, but here's what we should talk about if we do. And then you're like, oh yeah, but they announced all those things on Tuesday last week. I'm like, all right, yep, we got to talk about it. So I don't love it, but I think it's important, not only for the present, but also for the future of Apple's policies all around the world. So we are going to cover it. But I'll just say, I'm not covering it with glee. It's just, but we need to talk about it.
I find it to be a very interesting thing, because it is rare, I think, that we get to see Apple working something out in public. So, I find that to be quite interesting.
Yes,
because we
and one of my favorite
see
things
this.
to talk about is how Apple works, right? How and it's so much of it is in the black box. We can't tell.
But the problem with it is what you mentioned, is it makes me upset. Like, I get angry about it. I get frustrated and I get disappointed. And that's not necessarily a nice thing to keep feeling, but I do find great intrigue in this, and also just the kind of unprecedented nature of it, that like the European Union is like a cat, and it's just batting Apple around, and they're just having to, they don't have a choice really. They have to just keep doing what they're told within the limit that they will, and nobody really does this to them.
So my Macworld column last week was about the idea of people like friend of the show, Steve Troughton-Smith, talk about malicious compliance. And I think, based on especially what happened last week, I've decided that what they're doing is what I am calling incremental compliance.
Yeah.
And this is their strategy. Their strategy is do the minimum and then be told what else they need to do, and then do that. And I think that's interesting, because going into this, I could have read it two ways. I know that Apple doesn't want to do the equivalent of paying more than they need to in their taxes, right? Like, I get it. I especially Apple, they don't want to pay. They minimize their taxes. I get it. My point is that they don't want to do that, but it is interesting. Like, they also don't want to be put in a position where they have to change their rules every week based on an outside entity telling them yes, no, yes, no. They don't want that. But that seems to be the way that they're handling this, and I think maybe the only way they could handle it, especially if they don't want to just like give away the store. They literally need to do it this way. And so this is where we are now, is in a fascinating kind of give and take, where Apple keeps going, well, how about now? Okay, well, how about now? And hoping that over the course of time, that the net result of all of this effort is less than if they had done it, just thrown a bunch of things at the wall themselves, and it'll be essentially the minimum. The danger they have is antagonizing the regulators, who get frustrated that Apple is not getting it, and get grumpier and demand more from them. That's their sort of danger, is that they actually make it worse on themselves by doing it this way. But either way, this is the strategy now. It's very clear, is we're going to do this, and it's what we think is the minimum compliance, and then you tell us where we did it wrong. It's like a game of 20 questions or something, right? Or hot and cold, hide and seek kind of stuff, right? Where it's just like, how about now? No? Okay, how about now? And that is, I mean, the right way to do this is to negotiate all this with the regulator in advance, but apparently that's not how it works. So instead, we're going to do it in public.
I mean, I see the route in which you get to this, and I also see that there is a scenario in which the European Union just gave them a big rubber stamp in the first place, right? Like, Apple had a bunch of very smart people look at this law, and they created what they thought was the best possible outcome for this, but it's not worked out for them, and it seems like it's not working out for them. So now the problem that I believe that they are seeing with this approach is, one, antagonizing European Union and potentially other governments and regulators, but they are also alienating and upsetting the developer community, when realistically the amount of people that would have ever been affected by this from their larger partners is slim, but they are now upsetting everyone is upset, right? Like, because we've spoken about it, right? Facebook are upset, Microsoft's upset, everyone is upset with them. And so like I'm not sure that this is going to be in the long run the right way to have gone about this.
And my guess is that in 6 months or a year, when Apple has changed its policies dramatically from the original policies based on the feedback that they've gotten from the European regulators, that if they had taken that policy, which they didn't have, I grant you, but if they had taken that end result policy and announced it when they announced their DMA compliance, people would have been a lot less angry, right? They would have been like, oh, sideloading and this thing and that thing, and these terms seem reasonable. But instead, what they're doing, look, you said it, this is a negotiation happening in public. And this is why you don't want a negotiation happening in public.
Correct.
This is why, is, when we talk about like labor and union negotiations with management, like there are initial offers and they're outrageous, and then there's pressure, and then they come to an agreement ultimately, and it's compromised and all of these things. But generally, I mean, there are leaks with high-profile ones, but generally what ends up happening is both sides come out and say, we have reached an agreement that we're both satisfied with, and here it is. And instead, what we've got here is we're watching Apple's initial proposal, and then we're watching it batted back by the EU and saying, no, that's not good enough. It is fascinating on one level, but yes, this is the challenge, is that I think people are angrier at Apple than they would have been at the end result, because they're seeing Apple being dragged to these conclusions and not going willingly, and that I think makes people less thrilled about Apple. So that's the point of my column, was this is an eminently logical strategy. I do think it is, from Apple's point, and I think that at the end, the idea here is they're going to give away exactly what they need to and nothing more, and that there are going to be areas where Apple's doing stuff where the regulators are like, oh, it's fine, guys, it's fine, and they're going to get away with some stuff. But the danger is that the act of doing this will make it worse on them in the long run.
And this may be why the European Union does it the way that they do it, right? So then these companies get drugged through, or maybe they'll give up more because they don't want the bad PR. I don't know. So there were two other big changes here. So Apple has changed the policy that they had to say that now an app marketplace can exist and just have within it the apps from the developer of that marketplace. For example, Meta could have the Meta app marketplace, and it just include Facebook, Instagram, Threads, WhatsApp. That's it. They don't need to take outside apps.
This is Apple being a little cute with the definitions of this thing. Not only did they choose marketplaces instead of sideloading and said, oh, well, that's an and/or, so we're gonna choose or, which now they have not been able to. This is sort of like, marketplace. Well, we're going to hold you to that, and we're going to call this a marketplace, and it must be a true marketplace that is not just for your own apps. And the regulators are like, that's not what we meant. No.
Nice try. And also, Developers will be able to choose how they can design their own promotion, discounts, and deal screens as opposed to using Apple's templates. Because previously, if you wanted to tell people you had a different price outside of the App Store and then you did the link out to that, Apple were like, oh, you can only have it look a certain way. This is now not the case. It does still require that you accept the new terms within the EU to be able to do this. But yeah, that is a change. So no longer is it going to like scream at you. Unless you are using a non-Apple payment processor in-app, you still have some defined screens. But if you're linking out, you can choose how that page looks.
This is one of the only legitimate laugh out loud moments I had last week. Was all those templates we gave you, well, they're more of a suggestion.
Yeah.
And it just exemplifies the way this whole process has worked, where Apple's like, oh, we've got a whole system with a bunch of APIs for marketplaces, and this is how it's going to be. And then the next week they're like, also sideloading coming soon, right? And this is like that too, where it's like, you must do it this way. This is exactly how you must do it. Oh, no. If you want, we recommend you look at it as our example. It's like, try to do this, but you don't have to. Like, yeah, it's and Apple will not say, right? Apple's messaging all along is like, after discussing this with developers and other stakeholders. Other stakeholders? Yeah, okay.
One really big stakeholder. It was actually kind of the boss right now, and we don't like that.
No.
Do you want to talk anything else about the DMA today that you want to cover?
Yeah, I just I have some big picture kind of things to watch or questions to ask, and I don't think we're gonna get into it too deeply today. But I think just like, look, first off, I know that a bunch of people skip this chapter because they don't want to hear about this stuff, and I don't blame them. But they're not listening now. So all of you who've reached the end of DMA today, here are some things. Here's your homework if you want. One is, who's watching this happen? Because it's not just us. It is other regions and countries. And I think that it's important to keep in mind that this is also a stage that other regulators, other potential regulators, politicians in various locations are watching closely, right? And not just the US, but throughout the world, they're watching this and saying, how is the European Union pushing Apple around? What are they making Apple do? Do we like that? Could we get that for our constituents too? Because it is, and I think that if I'm a member of the House of Representatives or something, this is not a campaign announcement. I'm not, but if I was, and I was on like a tech subcommittee or something, I would look at this and say, you know what, better them than me. Right? Like, let's let the European regulators hash this out with Apple, and we just stand aside and like, I don't want the back and forth. I don't want all of this. Let's see where they get. And then the end point of that, then we'll have an idea. But make no mistake, they're watching. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Another question I have. Who is the European Commission protecting? And I mentioned this earlier. What's their priority? Is their priority to protect consumers? Is their priority to protect companies, big companies, with the thought that by protecting them, the consumers will be protected because they'll be given choice? But is that the case, or is that not the case? Or is it just shifting money from one company to another and the consumers get nothing? Are the consumers the end point here or not? Because a lot of cases they're not. The Apple book settlement is a great example of that, where the ebook world would have greatly benefited from having more competition in that market, and Apple was trying to do that by illegally colluding with publishers, as it turns out. But in the end, what happened is Amazon basically got its competition reduced, which made less competition in the market, which is, I would argue, worse for consumers. But that was the way that the rulings worked. And then the subcategory there is, are they protecting all companies, all developers? Or are they protecting big developers? And this goes to that rule about 1 million in the EU, because I've heard this argument from people, and I think it's a fair one, which is the EU really concerned about an indie developer who wants to do a side-loaded app that's cheap or free, and they need a lower bar set for them to be a trusted developer? Or are they only really concerned with Spotify, Epic, big fish, right? Like Facebook, Which is it?
Well, and also she said it's not just all developers, whether it's just all European developers. That could be, I mean, really that should
That's
be
true.
their focus. That should actually be their focus. But
yeah, I am dubious to that. I think that they're more concerned with, but this is a question, right? This is a thing to watch is, are they concerned with European developers or are they concerned with all developers who are doing business in the EU?
Yeah.
It's a question.
Yep.
Ask yourself that. Let that be one of the lenses you use to look at this situation. And then, do you have something there?
No, I was just gonna say like about the million, like the million number. That Apple made that up, right?
Yes.
And so like we'll see if that stands or not. I think this is Apple trying to be very specific and carving out a selection, a large swath of the potential developers.
Start big, right? And then be told to make it smaller. I think that's their whole incremental approach here.
Yep. And so we'll see, because I really do feel like there are probably not that many companies that this affects.
Well, this is my point here. This is a good one to see, what does the EU make Apple do, if anything? If the EU or the European Commission is happy with 1 million installs in the EU and 2 years in the App Store as a barrier, I think what it says is that they don't actually care about small developers at all.
Yeah.
Right? I think that that's it. Also, I can't look at that. I mean, talking about Steve Troughton-Smith saying they're concerned about the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is that people should have access and freedom to be able to do things like sideloading.
Yes.
The way it's written now, even if you want to make a sideloaded app, if you're not a developer now, you have to register as a developer, wait 2 years, and in the meantime, distribute an app in the App Store that's a hit.
That's a big hit.
It's entirely contrary to the entire spirit of the law.
Yeah,
so we'll see if it changes.
I don't think that's going to stand. I really don't. Like,
I can't imagine it.
Yeah, Unconnected last week, we did a draft of things that we think that will change in the next month, and this was one of mine. This whole like, there will
definition
of
what's a trustworthy developer. Yeah.
I don't see it. I don't see it holding water, because it's like
it doesn't make any sense.
All it is the gatekeeper. The company currently like described as a gatekeeper keeping another gate.
Yeah. Well, and it's gate. To be free of our gatekeeping, you must enter the gate, live within it for 2 years, be successful within the gate, and then we'll open the gate and let you out. It's like, no, that's not what this is supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So, but again, I've also heard the argument that in the end, the European regulators won't care about the little guy, and we'll see, right? Maybe. I mean, I really think this is a great test of that. Is that million barrier is designed to make it hard for anybody who isn't a giant developer to take advantage of this freedom.
Yep. Apple have made it quite clear that Apple have insinuated that Spotify and the European Union are working very closely together, right? They have insinuated this in the press releases that they put out. This will be a key to that, like understanding that, right? Like, if it ends up that all this stuff kind of stands, then the EU is being swayed by the larger companies that are lobbying with them.
Yeah. So we'll see. Another thing to watch. And then my last one, and then this will close out DMA Today for this week, but we'll probably be back next week. Who are we kidding?
Let's be honest.
Is this, which is, and this came up last week on another podcast, but I think it is worth asking the question and keeping this in mind as we talk about all this stuff, which is, what is the result of all this? Or to put it another way, will anybody care? Will any behavior change? Because one possible outcome of this is that Apple jumps through all these hoops to create a system where there's more freedom in the EU for app developers. And almost every app developer goes, nah, it's not, the App Store is fine. With the exception, like Epic and SetApp, and there's some that are going to try it. And then even beyond, will any developer care? Will any user care? And I think this is a legitimate question to ask is, in the long run, after all of this is said and done, how many users in the EU are going to say, yeah, I'm going to use an alternative browser with an alternative browser engine, okay, and I'm going to go to an alternative marketplace, and I'm going to sideload apps and all of that. I'm sure some will, but I would not be surprised. I mean, I'm leaving this as an open question. We'll see. But I would not be surprised if the answer is, people are trained to just use the App Store and they're going to keep on doing that. And that all of this talk and all of this effort and all of the work by Apple in building their APIs and then putting out new features because they're told they need to, after all of that, the average EU iPhone user is just going to keep doing what they're doing.
Right,
and that's using the App Store.
That would be a unequivocal success for Apple. That's what they're trying to make happen. That they would do all of this work, but this was money that they invested so they wouldn't have to lose anything.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that this isn't... I guess what I'm saying is never count out the inertia of the status quo wins a lot of the time. The incumbent wins a lot of the time. That it's possible there will be a breakthrough here that causes something that people absolutely have to do, and it's going to be the thing that has to be sideloaded, or it has to be installed from an alternative app store, and it becomes a hit, and it's like a thing that opens everybody's eyes, and that the way the iPhone works in Europe is totally unlike how it works elsewhere. It's possible, but like if I had to bet, I would probably bet on the status quo, because the status quo usually wins, right? Unless, short of, because what the European regulators are not doing is saying Apple must divest itself of the App Store in Europe. It must set up an App Store, subsidiary in Europe that runs the App Store completely separately. They're not saying that, right? But short of that, as long as Apple is able to basically keep doing the App Store the way it is, I'm not convinced that users aren't going to be just like, look, it's easier to buy stuff through Apple than to put in my credit card somewhere else. It's, I know that Apple has more, whether it's true or not, Apple is more concerned about security in the App Store. Like, there are lots of arguments that's like, it's just easier to just stay with the default. I'm not going to mess around with that stuff. I'm just going to stick with Apple. And yes, you're right. The more people who decide that, Apple benefits, Apple wins from that. But I just think it's something to watch, right? Because in the end, the goal of all of this regulation has been to actually change user behavior for the better so that everybody has a better experience. And I'm not sure it'll actually happen.